Disclaimer: this is my first real video, and my video editing skills are trash. Also, the audio quality is not the best. However, I still believe you will like this video as I believe my script's quality is okay. Just after the US-China negotiations in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia finished with the delegates of each side walking out, people started to speculate on the agreements and conflicts that happened during the meeting. Soon, the leaders of both countries met in Busan, South Korea, and after they walked out, people were sure that the first stage of the US-China trade war came to a temporary halt. From the start of the second Trump administration, tensions between US and China heightened. Trump previously threatened a 60% tariff on Chinese goods entering the US in his election campaign, and he soon acted on it. On February 1, 2025, Trump signed an executive order imposing 10% tariffs on imported Chinese goods, taking effect on February 4. He said it was to punish China for exporting certain products that are allegedly helping fentanyl production in Mexico that flows to the US. He also ended the tariff exemption of small packages less than $800, though in February 5, he said he needed to wait for this tariff collecting system to be placed so that the tariffs weren't actually collected until then. Then, on February 4, the MOF and the MOFCOM of China retaliated with a 15% tariff on coal, LNG, and a 10% tariff on crude oil from the US, plus export controls of certain rare earths. On February 10, 2025, Trump increased aluminum and steel import tariffs. Tensions continued to escalate in late February and March as both sides imposed more trade and other restrictions. Then there came Liberation Day, with Trump imposing a variety of tariff rates on most countries and an additional 34% on mainland China. With China's retaliations, tariffs escalated to unprecedented levels of 145% and 125% on China and US, respectively, effectively amounting to a de facto embargo. Although on April 9, Trump reduced tariffs for other countries to 10%, this act excluded China. Only in April 11, he exempted some electronics from China from the reciprocal tariffs. After multiple failed attempts from Trump to have his call answered by China, the delegates from the US and China were finally able to get in touch face-to-face on May 12 in Geneva, Switzerland, where multiple historical conferences were held. Here, a truce was made where the Liberation Day tariffs and other tariffs added after April 2, except for the 10% base tariffs from the US and the 10% of China's retaliatory tariffs were either cancelled or paused for 90 days. This truce would continue every 90 days, in which negotiations are then held in London, Stockholm, and Madrid. During September, US-China relationship seems relatively peaceful, but almost none were aware that this was only a lull before the storm. Now there was one thing. China's imports of US soybeans dropped significantly during the first part of 2025 and then plummeted to near zero. There were several reasons behind this, such as Chinese tariffs on US products and efforts from the Chinese government to pressure the US. There was a substantial threat to the Trump administration since farmers were staunch MAGAs and around 78 of them contributed votes to Trump. Possibly triggered by China's reluctance to order US soybeans, the US and China again started escalating sanctioning policies against each other. In September 13, China's MOFCOM issued an anti-dumping act on certain US-manufactured chips, and the US added 23 Chinese companies to an entity list. Perhaps China's actions were both a signal showing progress in domestic chip technologies and an act of applying pressures to the US just before the Madrid talks in September 14. Then, in September 29, the US tightened its noose on restricted Chinese companies by activating the rule in which unaffected subsidiaries of companies in the entity list or other similar lists would also face restrictions. This would probably be damaging to Chinese interests as thousands of new subsidiaries would be covered, and from some sources, up to 20,000 companies would fall victim to this. This would limit certain Chinese companies' way around US restrictions. Moreover, this may even accidentally put restrictions on companies outside of China, which are owned by Chinese companies, which makes it complicated for US companies to make out whether they could hold transactions with other companies. This would hence make it difficult for certain Chinese high-tech companies to expand their overseas industry and also make them less attractive to foreign investments, because these foreign investors would have to be wary of investing in firms effectively sanctioned by the US. These factors combined together arguably makes this penetrative rule impactful to Chinese tech companies and the Chinese market as a whole. So after September, both sides were escalating rapidly again. Tariffs, investigations, REE limits, and company bans all stacked on each other. China's tightening on REE exports to an astonishingly yet ambiguously strict level on October 9 was possibly a response to this 50% rule, as even using traces of Chinese REEs from December 1 requires a stamp from Chinese authorities. As many other videos have covered the extent to which China monopolizes the REE industry, this video will not cover much of this. Instead, let's just look at how Chinese restrictions threaten the US military industry. Elements like the neodymium and the praseodymium are especially important in permanent magnets and support flight control and stealth functions. However, multiple sources show that China absolutely dominates the production of these REEs. Although the US government has REE stockpiles for ND and PR, the specific weight in 2025 is unknown, and the stockpile for HREEs is even smaller, making military production depend on Chinese REEs. So it is quite safe to say that China's REE industry is a huge leverage against the US. Around the same time, on October 3, the US utilized the 301 investigation to charge ships related to China, which was designed to be executed on October 14. As evident, China dominates the shipbuilding industry in many aspects, with its only real competitors being South Korea and Japan. This action from the US would hamper ship exports and also reduce revenue in the Chinese shipping industry. Therefore, in order to apply pressure to the US, China retaliated accordingly. On October 14, China retaliated similarly to US ships and even sanctioned a US-related South Korean shipbuilding company. Because of this, Trump threatened a 100% tariff on China despite the truce that supposedly extends to November, triggering a retaliatory threat. A trade war loomed ahead again, as seemingly both powers were about to replay what had happened in April. Around October 25, Chinese and American delegates again convened in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. This meeting was just before the planned meeting of the Chinese and US leaders in Busan, South Korea. So during this meeting, the delegates worked to establish a framework on what would be discussed. After 2 days of tense discussions, both delegates came out and spoke with the media. The US side said that they made a constructive framework for further discussion and would not impose the 100% tariffs, though this is not really a win for China, as these tariffs are merely Trump's made-up cards against China. He also said that the US expects China to defer the latest REE controls, buy soybeans, and stated that the US controls did not change. This talk was an important signal to the world, as it hinted at the so-called G2 meeting, marking the end of the first stage of the US-China trade war. We've just talked about the timeline of events preceding the Trump-Xi summit, such as the battles and peace talks in early and mid-2025. And now, we finally arrive at the main topic. Before the summit, both sides made certain remarks concerning this meeting, some of which are pretty worth analyzing. Let's look at the American side first. Trump signed deals with Malaysia and Thailand on minerals, saying that it would enhance US national security. The deal with Malaysia is especially significant as the US announced that it would mitigate risks from Chinese export controls. Also, the US made similar deals with Japan. Theoretically, the US could secure its REE supply chain by getting minerals through the Lynas refinery plant in Malaysia and use Japan's important position in magnet production to their advantage. However, this is obviously some sort of propaganda and political signaling for several reasons. First, the US requires more leverage amid meetings with China to get a favorable position, and trying to mitigate this trump card for China could make the US seem more advantageous. So exaggerating achievements in dealings and broadcasting them is in line with the US interest. For example, there is a nuance in what the US told the world versus what Malaysia said. Moreover, the US could not overcome REE supply chain and refining issues in a mid-short term, despite help from its allies. This is mainly due to the lower market prices from China and the rest of the world's inability to mass-produce heavy REEs. Yes, Lynas, but it is still ramping up production. Another thing that happened before the meeting is Trump post on Truth Social. The G2 would be convening shortly. Obviously, Trump purposefully used the term G2 to make US-China relations seem more intimate, putting these two great powers in the same group. Some Chinese netizens may feel gratified by this statement, as Trump put China in a status level with the US. However, instead of feeling happy, they should feel wary of this. The US is not the beacon of civilization, and there isn't a free lunch, so don't expect the US really wants to rule the world with China. This is what is commonly called the Thucydides trap, where an existing power would almost certainly view a rising rival as an existential threat, ultimately leading to all-around conflicts. So, instead of being a gift, G2 is a trap for China. The Chinese government did not bluntly accept it or reject it in the 2010s, but responded by saying, there is enough room in the Pacific for both countries and a new type of major power relationship. This deliberate ambiguity reflects China's attitude towards the US, as China wants a stable relationship but does not want to be seen as trying to become part of G2. Some YouTubers believe that this shows China's willingness to be part of a duopoly and earn international influence. But in rising power, China is aware that it would receive sanctions and rivalry from the US, so it must go closer to the global south to consolidate economic and political resilience. Promoting G2 would also make China distant from these countries and make China seem like the US, giving an impression that China would exploit third world countries equally as the US. Moreover, the US would not see China as an equal counterpart, but as a supplier of cheap labor and manufactured products. Hence, for the Chinese government, supporting the idea of G2 is unnecessary and may be problematic. The G2 used by Trump last month and the G2 used by Obama earlier are very different. As with this meeting, Trump makes China an equivalently powerful rival. Still, the Chinese government is reluctant to be part of G2. As Speaker Guo Jiakun expressed in, China will forever stand with fellow developing countries, uphold multilateral trading systems with the WTO at its core, abide by the UN Charter. This is obviously showing a stance against G2 and simultaneously hinting at US's action that went against the UN and WTO. Aside from the interesting rhetoric from both sides, there are some other interesting things. For example, Trump said the Taiwan issue would not be discussed, which really didn't come up in the meeting, and he also iterated the possibility of restarting nuclear testing. The statement about nuclear testing is interesting, as the US has stopped nuclear testing for many decades. Let's have an overview of what happened during the meeting. Trump and Xi both arrived at Busan on October 30, and Trump first entered the stage. About 15 seconds later, Xi also arrived and shook hands with Trump. Then Trump, after patting Xi's back, said, "Nice to see you again," and Xi replied, "Me too." Trump also made a joke saying, "He's a tough negotiator, that's not good," in which Xi did not really reply. In this scene, Trump seems very enthusiastic about meeting with the Chinese leader. Well, or else he would not have wanted a call from Xi so much. On the other hand, Xi was pretty solemn and replied in a pretty formal tone. This is the difference between countries like China and the US, and this a decent microcosm of the difference in a political solemnity between them. Trump in particular likes to use informal language and has more personality, but Chinese leaders often speak very formally in public scenarios. Minus this layer of traditional solemnity, though, Xi still seems somewhat annoyed and does not want to care about Trump's jokes and body gestures. Basically, after this, they entered the conference room and complimented each other. Overall, Xi Jinping's intro was longer and contained some more info, like emphasizing China's action in promoting peace in Asia, etc. After this, the leaders had a meeting 1.5 hours long. Both of them came out. Like what many pointed out, before Xi got on his car, Trump whispered to him twice, making the mood seem more interesting. I mean, what was Trump saying? Anyways, that's what happened in the relatively short meeting. Trump said their meeting was a 12 out of 10, meaning that they finalized a lot of deals during the summit. Let's have a look. Returning to Washington, D.C., Trump announced a win, a massive victory, the White House called it. They say that China will delay the new REE export controls implemented on October 9 and issue general licenses valid for exports of rare earths, gallium, germanium, antimony, and graphite. They also say China would clear the retaliatory tariffs from March 4 and reduce American companies on China's entity list. Moreover, China would retract its countermeasures to the U.S.'s 301 investigation on Chinese ships, removing previous limitations put on U.S.'s ships. Aside from this, the U.S. mentioned soybeans and several vague deals such as China committing to stop fentanyl flow, allow flow of Nexperia chips to the EU, and stopping investigations on U.S. companies. On the other hand, the U.S. would suspend its reciprocal tariffs, except for the baseline 10%, and also reduce 10% fentanyl tariffs. The U.S. would also retract its 301 investigation and its 50% penetrative rule. Now let's see what they purposely did not say or exaggerated by comparing it to Chinese outlets and other sources, because in order to win, the U.S. often hyperbolizes their breakthroughs and make themselves seem dominant. Apart from most terms agreed by media from both sides, some nuances remained. For example, China did not specify the tonnage of agricultural products it would order from the U.S., which contrasted with the specific numbers the U.S. gave. However, Reuters reported that China did start to import soybeans from the U.S., signifying a short-term decrease in trade tensions. But the amount is still falling short of what the U.S. claimed, considering that there is only 2 months left for 2025 after the meeting. Moreover, on the issue of Nexperia, China did not back down and simply reopen exports of its production to the EU market. Instead, the Dutch government ceded its control over the company, at least symbolically, and outruled its original act of taking over Nexperia due to 50% rule. Around November 9, China started to allow civilian-only exports of Nexperia chips from Nexperia China, which takes up 80% of its production capacity. But despite this, exports are still overseen by the Chinese government. Therefore, what happened later concerning Nexperia isn't exactly what the US said in their so-called fact sheet. Many other terms are unilateral, vague, and hard to really implement, such as whether investigating a company or not, limiting fentanyl to what extent, etc. So basically, this was a rollback to March, as both sides canceled all sorts of tariffs, limits, and retaliatory measures. China stabilized trade relations with the U.S. and forced the U.S. to cancel all those 301 investigations, and so on, while still preserving the April policy of some REE export control. And the U.S. stabilized some of its REE imports and resumed agricultural trade with China. So who won? Who lost? Well, I believe it is too early to make a final statement, but in a certain perspective, both won. On one hand, China was able to effectively force the US to remove its newly implemented trade limitations on itself without needing to give up its own interests like what Japan and South Korea did. And the offensive moves of Trump also boosted the people's patriotic feelings, decreasing internal pressure from certain economic and social issues. On the other hand, Trump could go back and say he made another victory for the US and the farmers. He could say that he got a lot of investments from Japan, South Korea, and Europe. So, who lost? Apparently, the smaller countries stuck in the middle who made unwise decisions lost. Netherlands sided with the US and seized Xperia, later justifying it through the US 50% rule. However, as the Busan summit came to a close, all found out that the Netherlands ended looking foolish. Taking Japan and Korea, both were forced to give the US hundreds of billions of dollars in investment, at least on paper, merely for a slight decrease in tariffs that were implemented out of thin air in the first place. Japan is especially in great trouble, as tariffs would greatly reduce exports to the US and hit its already troublesome economy hard, as it probably did in this year. Moreover, as seen recently in the turmoil between Japan and China, Trump was reluctant to help Takehashi directly and said our allies have taken advantage of us more in trade than China has, despite China's strong reactions towards Japan's erroneous state regarding Taiwan. This clearly demonstrates the case where, when elephants fight, it is the grass that suffers. The smaller countries, especially those close to the US, were greatly damaged in this battle. Although the conflict in Trump's first year came to a halt, it is safe to say that this isn't even close to the end of the US-China trade war. Both sides are preparing for another round, possibly next year when the interim ends, or maybe sometime between if Trump suddenly loses his mind or something tense happens in the Pacific. No one knows when. In this period, China would accelerate its pace in breaking through US-dominated technology like chips and trying to gain an upper hand in future technologies like AI and nuclear fusion. On the other hand, the US would try to construct an REE supply chain excluding China, and Trump would externally continue to exploit US's allies and internally try to consolidate his position ahead of the midterm election. China proved itself to be able to fend off US attacks, but frankly speaking, the government could put itself in a stronger stance and try to exploit the Trump card of REEs to a greater extent. This way, the US would be under greater pressure and may submit to deals more favorable to China. However, doing this may make the EU more aligned with the US, which is among the reasons why China did not do so. This is the end of my first video. Please give a like and subscribe, as it is really an encouragement for me to continue making my videos. Bye!